She stood alone on the curb in a dirty, torn wedding dress, barefoot and frightened. The passing cars only sped up, until an old van stopped, carrying a homeless man and his dog. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments from where you watch this video. The morning sun rose like a golden veil over the rolling countryside, casting its gentle warmth across the manicured lawns and pristine white canopy of Bellwood Estate. A breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the satin ribbons that hung from ivory arbors and swayed through the lavender arrangements lining the ceremony path. In the main house, vendors buzzed between rooms like bees in a hive, perfecting every detail. The smell of peonies and lemon polish filled the air. It was a scene pulled straight from a bridal magazine. Naya stood motionless before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, her breath shallow, eyes wide. Her white gown, lace bodice, modest neckline, flowing tulle skirt, clung to her form like it had been stitched for a stranger. The reflection staring back at her felt unfamiliar. Her dark skin glowed against the pale fabric. Her tight curls had been pinned back into a low chignon, and pearl earrings hung from her lobes. She looked beautiful, they told her, graceful, elegant, but inside she felt like an actress trapped in a play she hadn't written. From outside the closed door, laughter echoed, deep masculine laughter, and her spine stiffened. She didn't belong here. She had felt it the moment she stepped onto the estate's gravel driveway, when the valet took one look at her and hesitated a beat too long. Throughout the morning, she had fielded silent glances from the caterers, the makeup artist who avoided eye contact, and the bridesmaids who spoke to her with rehearsed kindness. It wasn't overt, not really, but it pressed against her like a hand on her shoulder, guiding her to the margins. Still, she had clung to the idea that love would bridge the gap, that Randall loved her enough to make space for her in his world of manicured families, country clubs, and dinner parties, that when he had dropped to one knee and proposed to her in that art gallery, he had meant every word. She had believed in the fantasy, in the possibility that she could be someone worthy of the fairy tale. A soft knock at the door stirred her. One of Randall's cousins, Amanda, or maybe Allison, poked her head in. "You ready?" she asked with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "They're all waiting." Naya swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. She smoothed her skirt with trembling fingers and followed the cousin down the corridor, down the curved staircase, out into the light. Guests were already seated in rows of white chairs on the lawn, their designer shoes digging slightly into the grass. A string quartet played something classical and unobtrusive. As she walked the aisle, escorted by a coordinator instead of a father, hers had passed away years ago, she could feel dozens of eyes on her, judging, calculating, wondering. Randall stood beneath the arbor, flanked by his groomsmen, all in tailored tuxedos. His expression was unreadable as she approached. No smile, no warmth, just that square jaw and expensive haircut. She took her place beside him, heart thudding like a drumbeat in her chest. The officiant began speaking, voice polished and firm. But before he could get far, Randall lifted his hand. "I can't do this," he said. The officiant paused. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I'm sorry," Randall continued, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I thought I could. I really did. But this was a mistake." A stunned silence fell. Naya blinked. "What are you—" He stepped back from her. "You don't belong in this world, Naya. We both know that. You're not compatible with the life I'm building." Laughter erupted from one of his groomsmen. Another clapped sarcastically. "You owe me $50, he shouted. "I said he'd cut it before the vows." "I knew it," someone else added. Told you it was just a flex. The words hit Naya like stones. She looked around, at the guests, many of whom were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others who stared at her with a mix of amusement and pity. The bridesmaids were whispering, their faces a cocktail of horror and relief. Randall's mother stood with her arms crossed, unmoved. His father didn't meet her eyes. You said you loved me?" Naya whispered, her voice cracking. Randall shrugged. "I said what I needed to. But come on, Naya. Did you really think this would work? Look around. This isn't your world. This isn't your story." Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then Randall turned to the crowd, chuckled, and added, "Thanks for being a good sport, though. Seriously, that took guts." It was the final blow. The coordinator approached, apologetic, whispering something about helping her inside. But before she could answer, someone grabbed her arm. One of the venue's security guards, following an order from Randall's family, gently but firmly escorted her away from the ceremony. No one stopped them. She was led around the back, past the kitchen, past the dumpsters, past the staff parking lot. The heels she wore caught in the grass, then in the gravel. Her veil snagged on a bush and tore. By the time she reached the road beyond the estate, she was barefoot, her once pristine gown stained with mud and tears. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. Away from the laughter, the cameras, the smug smiles, away from the betrayal. She ran through fields, over fences, across a shallow creek. Her dress caught on thorns. Her feet bled. Her lungs burned. By the time the sun had sunk below the hills, Naya found herself stumbling along the shoulder of a country highway, dress clinging to her legs, hair soaked from a passing storm. Every step felt heavier than the last. Her hands trembled. Her vision blurred. Headlights approached in the distance, the only light in the growing dark. And she kept walking, because there was nowhere else to go. The headlights cut through the descending mist like pale knives, sweeping over the wet shoulder of the road and glinting off patches of gravel. Behind the wheel of the groaning RV, M. Arton adjusted his glasses with a grunt, squinting against the fog. The windshield wipers beat in a slow, rhythmic thump, matching the weary thud of his heart. He had been driving for hours, maybe too many, but what did it matter? There was no schedule, no destination, just the road, the hum of old tires on asphalt, and the occasional grunt from the old mutt curled at his feet. Bandit, his dog, shifted and let out a low sigh as Martin eased off the gas. Something, some flicker at the edge of the headlights, had caught his attention. A shape. Human? Maybe. He peered harder through the condensation on the glass. His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as he leaned forward. There, standing like a ghost at the edge of the road. Martin muttered under his breath and flicked on the high beams. The figure emerged from the gloom slowly, as though torn from the shadows. A girl, or woman, young, though he couldn't say exactly how young. She was barefoot, arms wrapped tightly around herself, dressed in something that shimmered faintly white despite the filth and rain. At first, he thought it might be a nightgown. But as he drew closer, he saw the fabric, a ruined wedding dress, sodden and torn, trailing threads and clumps of grass. Her hair hung in soaked, tangled ropes, and streaks of mud ran down her legs. Martin cursed softly. The voice of reason immediately kicked in. Don't stop. It could be a trap. Could be drugs, mental illness, or worse. A setup. Plenty of stories like that, even in the middle of nowhere. But she didn't move, didn't signal, Didn't even glance up at the sound of the engine. Just stood there like the storm had carved her out of the very air and left her behind. He drove past. For a full 20 seconds, he watched her in the rearview mirror, a shrinking silhouette in the mist. Bandit sat up suddenly, ears perked, and gave a short, sharp whine. Martin slowed the vehicle. "Don't give me that," he muttered. "We don't have room. We barely have food." Bandit growled low, not angry, but impatient. Martin exhaled through his nose. His ribs ached. His joints protested. He stared into the mirror again. The girl hadn't moved. She could have been a mannequin for all her stillness. Another whine from Bandit, this time softer, almost pleading. "Fine," Martin grumbled. He guided the RV to a grumbling stop, the brakes shrieking faintly, and backed up carefully until the girl was just ahead of the passenger door. The road was slick, the shoulder narrow. He threw the vehicle into park and grabbed his flashlight, slipping his feet into his old boots. The door groaned open, rain drizzled down, tapping his cap like small fingers. As he stepped out, Bandit moved to the open door, tail wagging hesitantly. "Hey," Martin called gently. "You okay, miss?" No answer. He kept walking, slowly, both hands visible. He'd learned long ago not to startle people, especially broken ones. And she was broken. He saw it up close now. Her skin was pale under the grime, her lips cracked and trembling, and there were bruises along her collarbone. Her arms were crossed tight around her chest, not in defiance, but as if she were holding herself together. "Don't mean any harm," he said, keeping his voice low. "Just seems like you could use somewhere dry." She flinched at the sound of his voice, but didn't retreat. Her eyes lifted at last, big eyes, dark, haunted, a look he'd seen once in a starving dog. Uncertain whether to hope or run, Martin took off his flannel jacket and stepped forward slowly, draping it over her shoulders. Her fingers clutched it like a drowning person grabs a rope. "You can sit inside for a while," he added, "out of the rain. Me and the dog, we don't bite." Still, she didn't speak. Martin waited a few more seconds, then turned and walked back toward the RV, glancing once to make sure she followed. She did. Inside, Bandit whined again, but this time it was pure concern. The dog backed up a step, letting her climb the stairs, then nuzzled her knee. She gave no response, just sat down heavily on the passenger bench, pulling the jacket tighter. Martin grabbed an old wool blanket from the back and passed it to her. Her hands shook as she took it. The RV smelled faintly of old grease and gasoline and the familiar musk of dog. It wasn't clean, but it was dry and warm. The heater hummed lowly from under the dashboard. "You hungry?" he asked, rummaging in a cupboard. "I've got crackers, water, nothing fancy." Still no answer. He handed her a bottle and a wrap pack of saltines. She tore them open with jerky movements, devouring the food with small, panicked bites, like someone used to going without. Martin sat behind the wheel again, started the engine, and guided the RV back onto the road. They rode in silence for a while. Just the rain tapping against the metal, the hiss of the tires, and Bandit's occasional sniffing. Martin didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He'd lived long enough to know when a person had been dragged through hell and back. He adjusted the rearview mirror to get a better look. Her face was gaunt, streaked with dirt, but underneath it, she was beautiful. The kind of beauty that had nothing to do with makeup or clothes. A quiet beauty. Real. "I'm Martin," he said eventually, more to the road than to her. She didn't respond right away. Then, in a voice so thin it nearly vanished into the hum of the RV, she said, "Naya." Martin nodded once. Good name. A long pause followed. Then, as the mist thickened again outside, she added, "He left me. At the altar. Martin's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. He said I wasn't good enough, she whispered. Said marrying me was a mistake. Martin said nothing. They laughed. His friends, they bet on how long I'd last before begging him to take me back. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she turned her face toward the window, the glass fogging under her breath. Martin let the silence stretch. Finally, he said, "The hell with them." Her shoulders hitched slightly, but she didn't speak again. A small diner appeared ahead, neon signs flickering through the mist. Martin pulled into the lot and cut the engine. He looked at her. "You need something warm. Food that's not crackers. Come on." She looked at him with wide eyes, uncertain. "You're safe," he said. "I promise you that." It took a minute, but eventually she nodded. He helped her down. She stumbled once, her bare feet aching, but steadied herself. The jacket dwarfed her frame. The dress beneath it was a ruin. Inside the diner, heads turned. A trucker in a stained cap, a waitress with a tired smile, a young man eating alone. All of them looked. None of them spoke. Martin led her to a booth near the window and ordered pancakes and hot chocolate for both of them. The waitress raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. When the food came, Naya stared at it as if she didn't quite believe it was real. Then she ate, slow, careful bites. Martin didn't rush her. He sipped his coffee and let her take her time. Eventually, her shoulders dropped a little. Some of the ice in her eyes melted. "You're not broken," he said quietly. "You're bruised. There's a difference." Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't fall from pain. They fell from the weight of finally hearing something kind. And in the background, Bandit curled at their feet, warm and watchful, a silent guardian in a world that had nearly forgotten her. Morning came slow and gray, creeping across the clouds like a tired hand. The drizzle had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the world soaked and cold. The RV sat in the back lot of the diner, its tired shell blending with the surrounding silence. Inside, the dim light from the small window above the sink bathed the cluttered space in a bluish hue. Naya stirred beneath the blanket, her body curled on the makeshift cot at the back of the RV. The wool scratched against her arms, but it was warmer than any surface she'd slept on in weeks. Her mind flickered somewhere between dream and memory. A sharp echo of laughter, a clink of champagne glasses, the cold slap of the ground beneath her feet. Her eyes snapped open. She wasn't there. Not anymore. She was somewhere new, somewhere different. She sat up slowly, brushing a strand of tangled hair from her face. Martin sat at the small counter near the driver's seat, reading a tattered paperback. His thick fingers held the book like it might dissolve if he gripped it too hard. A mug of steaming coffee sat nearby, and Bandit lay at his feet, tail thumping softly as he noticed her movement. "Mornin'," Martin said without looking up. Naya swallowed, her throat dry. "Mornin'." It was the first word she'd spoken that wasn't soaked in tears or tremors. Martin didn't comment on it. He simply reached over and poured a second mug of coffee, sliding it across the counter. She approached cautiously, her bare feet padding against the cold floor, and accepted the mug with both hands. The warmth bit into her fingers like fire, but she didn't let go. "Found a spot off the main road," Martin said after a moment. "Quiet, no eyes on us." Naya nodded. The silence between them was less heavy than the night before, more like the slow breath of something thawing. She sipped the bitter drink and winced slightly. It was strong, unfiltered, the kind of coffee that left a burn on the tongue. Still, she drank it. They didn't talk much. Martin wasn't a man of stories, and Naya had nothing left to say. Instead, she helped where she could. She swept the crumbs off the floor with a dustpan missing half its bristles. She folded the spare blankets, stacked the empty cans. She watched as Martin tinkered with the generator, explaining under his breath how to clean the filter, check the fuel line. She listened. Later that day, they drove out to a riverbank. Martin said he needed to check something on the engine that required still ground. In truth, he'd seen the way Naya kept touching her face, her arms, her hair like they were foreign. She needed a moment, a reset. The river glistened under the weak sunlight, rushing gently over smooth rocks. Naya stood near the edge, barefoot again, the tattered remains of her wedding dress clinging to her legs. She stared at the water for a long time. Then she stepped in, just her feet at first, then her calves. The cold bit sharply, but she didn't move. She dipped a cupped hand into the current and brought it to her face. The dirt came off slowly, then all at once. Her hands worked through her hair, untangling the filth. She knelt, scrubbed her arms, her neck, every inch of skin that could be reached. The dress she peeled off piece by piece, the bottom half already shredded. She left it in a heap on the shore and pulled on the oversized hoodie Martin had given her earlier. It smelled like old tobacco and cedarwood. She didn't mind. Martin didn't watch. He sat on a fallen log nearby, head down, scratching a note in a small, dog-eared notebook. Bandit lay stretched out beside him, belly to the earth, snoring softly. By the time Naya returned, her skin glowed pink from the cold, but her shoulders had straightened. Her steps were less hesitant. Back in the RV, she sat with a towel around her hair and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. It wasn't the same face that had left the altar. There were dark circles, bruises, exhaustion, but there was also something sharper, a quiet resilience that hadn't been there before. She took a pair of scissors from Martin's toolbox and cut the remaining strands of her veil from her hair. Then she grabbed the singed edges of the wedding dress, what was left of it, and folded it neatly. Later, when they made a fire that night, she placed it carefully among the kindling and watched it burn. The smoke spiraled into the dark like a ghost being exorcised. Martin passed her a tin of beans and 2 forks. She didn't hesitate this time. They ate in silence, the fire cracking between them. Days bled together after that. They stayed on the move. Small towns, empty fields, gas station rest stops. Martin showed her how to refill water from public spigots, how to fix a jammed window crank, how to cook rice over a propane flame. Naya began to speak more, though rarely about herself. She asked questions. She laughed once at a joke Martin made about Bandit stealing beef jerky. It startled them both. One morning, she woke up before dawn and found Martin already outside, heating coffee over a portable stove. She sat beside him on the folding step, knees drawn to her chest. "You always live like this?" she asked. Martin looked into his cup. "Not always." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, but the silence they shared felt different now, less like a void, more like a pact. One afternoon, they stopped at a roadside flea market. Naya wandered between the rows of old furniture, cracked dishware, books missing covers. At a stall run by an elderly woman with a thick southern accent, she found a threadbare canvas bag and a faded jean jacket. The woman didn't charge her. "You got a kind face," she said. "Ain't no price on kindness." Naya didn't know what to say. She thanked her and walked away with tears pricking her eyes. In the evenings, she started helping Martin clean out the RV. She rearranged the pantry, washed the windows, even fixed the radio using a pair of tweezers and borrowed wire. The first time music filled the space again, some old blues track, Martin looked at her with something close to amazement. "You might just be a genius," he muttered. She smiled, a small, hesitant thing, but it stayed. At night, Naya sometimes sat on the steps of the RV, staring up at the stars. Bandit would rest his head in her lap, and she'd run her fingers through his fur. She still didn't talk about Randall, about the wedding, about the betrayal. The pain was too fresh, the shame too raw. But in those quiet moments, something inside her began to shift. The weight she'd carried in her chest began to loosen, like old rope fraying at the edges. One evening, while organizing the cabinets, she found a photo wedged behind a box of screws. It showed a young girl, maybe 10, grinning with 2 front teeth missing, her arms wrapped around a tall man with a thick beard and calloused hands. Martin. She handed it to him without a word. He looked at it for a long time before tucking it back in the box. "My daughter," he said softly. "Haven't seen her in over 15 years. Naya didn't ask why. She just nodded and put the box back in its place. As the days stretched on, something resembling routine took hold. Naya cooked simple meals. Martin taught her how to check tire pressure. She read from his paperbacks, sometimes aloud. At a diner in a quiet Georgia town, a waitress complimented her jacket. Naya smiled and said thank you without flinching. In the mirror now, she saw someone new. Not the humiliated bride, not the runaway, but a woman who had survived something unspeakable and was still standing. One night, as they lay parked beneath a canopy of trees, Naya whispered into the dark, "Thank you." Martin didn't reply, but she heard the shift of his weight, the creak of his cot. And the silence that followed was not empty, but full. Outside, the wind moved through the leaves like a lullaby, and the fire in the rusted pit flickered low. Tomorrow would bring another road, another stop, another small piece of healing. But tonight, there was bread, warmth, and silence. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The sky had shifted again, from the soft blue haze of late autumn mornings to the grim steel of winter's breath. Trees stood bare along the roadside, their branches like brittle fingers scratching at the wind. The RV groaned under its own age as it climbed a narrow stretch of highway, the hum of the tires nearly drowned out by gusts that rattled the windows. Inside, the smell of instant coffee mixed with the faint aroma of dog fur and rust. Naya sat curled in the passenger seat, a dog-eared book in her lap, her thumb mindlessly brushing against the worn pages as the world passed by. Martin drove in silence, his hands firm on the wheel, eyes narrowed under the brim of his cap. Bandit lay in the back, his nose twitching in his sleep. It had been a quiet morning, like most since they'd first met. They no longer spoke in awkward, measured sentences. Now, silence was a shared language, comfortable, unforced. Trust had settled into the cramped space between them, unspoken but certain. Naya reached for her thermos, unscrewed the lid, and took a sip. She turned to Martin and said, almost absently, "I think I'm getting used to waking up in new places." Martin grunted softly, a sound that could mean anything from agreement to amusement. She smiled faintly and looked back out the window. They had found a kind of rhythm. Wake with the sun, find water, make breakfast, drive, stop somewhere far from the noise, sleep. It was a life pieced together with threadbare routines and brief moments of stillness. And in those moments, Naya was beginning to feel like herself again. Or perhaps someone she had never had the chance to become. It wasn't until that afternoon that the mood shifted. They had stopped at a modest gas station on the edge of a nameless town, the kind that looked like it had been forgotten by progress. The pump creaked as Martin filled the tank, while Naya wandered into the attached convenience store to stretch her legs. Inside, the place smelled of cheap cleaner and stale jerky. A TV mounted near the register played some daytime talk show, volume too low to hear, but subtitles flashing across the screen. She was in the snack aisle where she heard the cashier's voice rise. "Hey," the woman called, waving her hand. "Aren't you that girl?" Naya turned slowly. The woman behind the counter was in her 40s, hair piled into a messy bun, chewing a piece of gum like it owed her money. Her eyes were wide with recognition. "I knew I seen you somewhere," the woman said, grabbing a phone from the counter. "You're that bride from the video." A flush of cold rolled over Naya's skin. Her limbs froze. A television flickered above them, and now she could see it. Her face, tear-streaked, humiliated, running across a wedding venue in a shredded dress. The clip was blurry, distant, but unmistakably her. Beneath it, a caption read, "Runaway Bride Hoax. Was it all an act?" Naya dropped the bag of crackers in her hand and backed away. The cashier started laughing, not cruelly, but with the giddy delight of someone who'd spotted a celebrity in the wild. Martin was at the door in seconds. He took one look at Naya's face, then turned to the woman. "Problem?" he asked evenly. The woman shrugged. "No problem. Just saying, she's famous now." Naya was already outside, the cold air scraping at her cheeks. She didn't stop until she reached the RV. She climbed inside and sat down hard, breath heaving. Martin followed a moment later, closed the door quietly behind him, and started the engine. They drove for nearly an hour before she spoke. "They're still laughing," she said. Martin didn't look at her, but his jaw tightened. "It's been months," she whispered, "and they're still watching it, still showing it to strangers." Martin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Fools watch what makes them feel big, and nothing makes small people feel bigger than someone else's pain." Naya turned her head toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her, distorted by the slight fog on the glass. That night, they camped in a wooded area behind an abandoned hardware store. The RV sat parked between two massive oaks, branches overhead like a net of bone and bark. Martin worked in the engine compartment while Naya sat at the fire ring, feeding it small twigs. Bandit lay beside her, head resting on her foot. She wasn't afraid, not in the way she had been, but something had shifted inside her again. Not back to fear, but to something colder. A tension, a readiness. The next morning, Martin found a note wedged under the windshield wiper. It was scrawled in red marker, the letters sharp and angry. "You should have stayed where you belong." He showed it to Naya without comment. Her hands trembled. "They found us." Martin nodded. "Or someone's trying to scare you." "But how? The video? The town? I didn't talk to anyone." Martin looked around, scanned the trees. "Doesn't matter how. We don't stay. We move." They drove in silence. Naya stared at the note, folded in her lap until the creases threatened to tear. They reached out to someone Martin hadn't spoken to in years, a man named Jerry who lived 2 states over in a town surrounded by cornfields and forgotten highways. Jerry had been part of a motorcycle club once, back when Martin's knuckles were less brittle and his back could still handle bar fights. They hadn't parted on the best terms, but favors had a way of aging well, and Martin knew Jerry owed him. The ride to Jerry's place was long and tense. Every car that drove behind them too long made Naya flinch. Every rest stop made Martin check his pockets twice. But they arrived without incident. Jerry's garage looked like a skeleton of old steel and oil stains, the kind of place that smelled of burnt rubber and secrets. The man himself was broader now, slower, with a belly that hung over his belt and tattoos that had faded into ghosts on his skin. But when he saw Martin, his eyes narrowed with familiarity, not hostility. "Well, I'll be damned," Jerry said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You look like hell, Marty." "I'm not here for nostalgia," Martin said. Jerry looked past him to Naya, who stood behind him with her arms crossed and her hood up. "You in trouble?" Martin didn't answer. Jerry nodded once and motioned them inside. The garage had a back room with a cot, a mini fridge, and a space heater. It wasn't much, but it was clean and quiet. Jerry's wife, Molly, brought out a stack of clothes, some too big, some too small, but all clean. Naya picked through them silently, choosing a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt that reminded her of Martin's jacket. For the first time in weeks, she took a shower with real water pressure. She stood beneath it until her skin turned red. When she stepped out and saw herself in the mirror, clean, dressed, and dry, she barely recognized the woman staring back. That night, as they sat in Jerry's cluttered kitchen eating reheated chili, Naya told them everything, not all at once, not in dramatic detail, but piece by piece like puzzle corners finally snapping into place. When she was done, Jerry leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. Naya looked at Martin, then at Molly, then down at her bowl. "I want to stop running," she said. "I want to stop being afraid." Jerry nodded. "Then you're going to need some help." Martin reached into his coat and pulled out the photo Naya had found days ago. He placed it on the table, smoothing the edges. "That help starts here," he said. And just outside, behind the garage, the old RV stood like a relic, its tires muddy, its windows streaked, but still solid, still waiting. And though they had lost nearly everything, the road ahead remained, open and silent and unfinished. The morning after the fire smelled like damp smoke and scorched rubber. The air still held the weight of something lost, though the flames had long since died down. The RV had been reduced to a twisted skeleton of steel and melted plastic. The windows were gone, the roof bowed inward, and the walls looked as if they'd been clawed open by time itself. The blaze had consumed everything they owned, what little there had been. Naya stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the hem of her borrowed flannel brushing her knees. Her face was unreadable, pale beneath the first gray light of dawn, but her eyes glistened, not from tears, but from something harder. Martin stood beside her, arms slack at his sides, staring at what remained of their rolling shelter. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His face was drawn, mouth pressed into a tight, trembling line. Even Bandit, usually restless in the morning, sat silently between them, ears flat. Jerry stepped up behind them, a thermos in hand. He offered it to Martin, who accepted it wordlessly. The older man took a slow sip, then lowered the cup and looked out across the blackened remains of his home. "It was old," Martin said, his voice cracked and quiet. "But she held together longer than I ever expected." "It was more than a rig," Naya replied. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the soot-covered axle, now half buried in the mud. Inside the garage, Molly had laid out more clothes, a blanket, a set of battered toiletries. She didn't ask questions, didn't comment on the smoke-stained state of their clothes. Her kindness was practical and wordless, and in that way, it suited them perfectly. They stayed with Jerry and Molly for several days, sleeping in a converted storage room filled with the smell of oil and rust. The mattress was lumpy and the space cold at night, but there was something deeply comforting about the enclosed walls, the certainty of a locked door. Naya helped clean the shop each morning, sweeping out metal shavings and rearranging dusty shelves of forgotten tools. Martin assisted Jerry with minor engine repairs, though his hands, stiff from years of hard use, weren't what they used to be. In the evenings, they ate simple meals together around the kitchen table: meatloaf, canned vegetables, bread with margarine. Conversation was sparse but warm. Bandit sprawled under the table like a lazy sentinel. On the third day, Molly made a quiet suggestion over dinner. "There's a cafe in town. My sister runs it. She could use help. Nothing fancy. Dishwashing mostly. Maybe some prep work if she likes you." Naya looked up slowly. "Me?" "You need a start," Molly said, not unkindly. "That's what this is." Naya glanced at Martin. He didn't speak, but he gave a small nod of encouragement. She began work the next morning. The cafe was a squat brick building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read Gracie's. Inside, it smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee, and the tiles underfoot stuck slightly with each step. The owner, a stout woman with a no-nonsense attitude and steel-gray hair, handed Naya a stained apron and pointed to the back without introductions. Washing dishes in a diner wasn't glamorous. It was loud, wet, and repetitive. But Naya took to it with a quiet resolve. She didn't flinch at the heat of the water or the clatter of silverware. She scrubbed plates until her fingers wrinkled and the muscles in her arms ached. She kept her head down, said little, and listened to everything. She listened to how the waitresses joked with the regulars, how the cook cursed under his breath when the grill flared, how the bell above the door jingled with each new customer. She listened and absorbed, and every now and then someone would notice the way she worked, not just fast, but with purpose. On her third day, one of the waitresses, a tall redhead named Jody, offered her a cup of cocoa during a break. On her fifth, the cook handed her a slice of pie at the end of her shift. He didn't smile, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. At night, Naya returned to the garage, her apron folded neatly in her hands, her feet sore and her shoulders heavy. Martin would be waiting, seated on the back step, Bandit curled at his feet. He would offer her coffee or a bite of whatever Molly had cooked, and they'd sit in companionable silence until the dark took the edges of the world. One evening, as she dried her hair with a towel after a long shower, she found a flyer tucked under her blanket. It was for GED night classes at the community center 3 towns over. There was a note scribbled on the bottom in Martin's shaky handwriting. Just in case. Naya stared at the paper for a long time. Then she folded it and slid it into her backpack. She signed up for the classes a week later. Twice a week, she caught a ride with Jody's cousin, who delivered bread to the cafe and didn't mind the detour. The first class was awkward. She hadn't sat at a desk in years. Her fingers fumbled with the pencil, and the textbook seemed impossibly dense. But she returned. And again. And again. Martin watched it happen with quiet pride. He didn't hover or comment, but he was there at the end of each shift, each class, with warm coffee and a steady presence. He fixed bikes in Jerry's shop for pocket money, did odd jobs for neighbors. He said little about the past, but one afternoon, Naya noticed him carving something into a block of wood with a pocket knife. It looked like the shape of their old RV, smoke curling from the roof. "You're not trying to rebuild it?" she asked, only half joking. Martin looked up and gave her a rare, full smile. "Not that one." She nodded. "Good, that one burned." But they hadn't. They had survived it. Spring came slowly, but when it did, it came with wildflowers along the ditches and the smell of freshly turned soil. The cafe started opening earlier, and Nia began helping with morning prep, cracking eggs, slicing tomatoes, brewing coffee. Gracie trusted her enough to leave her in charge of the register when she stepped out. One morning, a man came in and stared at her for too long. She met his eyes and didn't look away. He dropped his gaze first. She was different now, not immune to fear, but no longer paralyzed by it. On the anniversary of the day she met Martin, they sat on the steps of the small trailer Jerry had helped them acquire. It was no bigger than a shipping container, barely held heat, and had a single rusted sink, but it was theirs. Nia brought out 2 plates of grilled cheese sandwiches and split a can of soup between them. Martin offered a toast, water in a plastic cup. "To roadkill and rusty bolts," he said. Nia laughed, a real one, and clinked her cup to his. "And to second chances," she added. Later that night, when Martin was asleep and Bandit was snoring at the foot of the cot, Nia pulled out a new notebook. She opened to the first page and wrote a single sentence. "I didn't vanish." She stared at the words for a long time, then closed the cover. Outside, wind rustled the edges of the trees, and the stars blinked high and cold above. But inside, the warmth lingered, not from the heater or the soup, but from the quiet, undeniable truth that somewhere along the way she had begun to build again, not out of desperation, but from something stronger: hope. The years had a way of sliding by when no one was watching. One day turned into another until the calendar no longer mattered. But for Nia, the passage of time had begun to measure itself differently, not in days lost or roads traveled, but in the tiny victories that stitched her new life together. It had been just over a year and a half since she had fled the wedding that wasn't, since she had been dragged through the mud and spat out into the world like a discarded secret. Now, she woke each morning in a small room at the edge of a park with cracked walls and a window that overlooked a gravel lot. Her bed was narrow, her dresser old and mismatched, but it was hers. A coffee mug sat chipped on the sill, and beside it, a photograph taped to the glass. Bandit asleep on Martin's lap, both snoring in identical rhythm. Martin had taken a job as a night watchman at the town's recycling plant. The work was dull, slow, and solitary, but he liked it. He liked the silence, the stillness, the safety of 4 locked walls. Every night at 6, he walked there with a thermos in one hand and a small flashlight in the other. Every morning at 7, he returned, tired but content, and fed Bandit breakfast scraps from his lunchbox. Bandit had aged quickly in the past few months. His once bouncy steps had turned into slow shuffles. His eyes were cloudy and his hips stiff, but he still waited every morning at the trailer door, tail wagging weakly when Martin reappeared. He never complained. He never stopped watching over them. Nia's routine had become familiar. She still worked at the cafe, but now she wore a name tag and handled the morning shift. Gracie had offered her more hours, then eventually handed her a key. The register responded to her touch as if it belonged to her, and customers greeted her by name. She knew their coffee orders before they opened their mouths, and she could spot trouble before it crossed the threshold. But she never allowed herself to become complacent. That luxury still felt too far out of reach. In the evenings, she attended her GED classes, now in the final stretch. Her binder was worn, pages filled with highlighter marks and scribbled formulas. She had learned to trust her own handwriting again, to believe that answers lived inside her brain, waiting to be recalled. The first time she passed a test with a perfect score, She stared at the paper for nearly a minute before folding it slowly and slipping it into her bag, afraid it might vanish if she looked too long. On Sundays, she volunteered at the shelter downtown. It wasn't a big place, but it was busy. Women arrived with children, with bruises, with nothing. Some came in tears, some came in silence. Naya knew the look in their eyes. She remembered that gaze in her own reflection. She never told them her story, not all of it, but she gave them warm food, extra blankets, and the kind of kindness that wasn't wrapped in pity. Martin came by the shelter sometimes, usually with donations, old boots, spare canned goods, worn coats. He'd drop them off without fanfare, tip his cap, and disappear before anyone could ask questions. The staff came to know him as the quiet one with the dog. Naya always smiled when she heard it. The two of them still spent their evenings together whenever they could. Sometimes they sat in the park with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Other times they returned to the trailer and played cards by the light of an old desk lamp. Bandit curled nearby, a folded blanket his throne. They didn't talk much about the past, but they spoke of the future more often than they used to. It was on one of those nights, when the wind outside tapped gently against the windows and the coffee had gone cold, that Naya turned to Martin with something new in her voice. "I think I want to open something. A place. For girls like me." Martin looked at her without surprise. "You already have." "I mean more than the shelter. Something bigger, long-term, a program maybe, a real foundation." He nodded once. "You could." "I think I will." The idea began as a whisper but grew quickly. Naya spent her breaks sketching floor plans on napkins, scribbling names, drawing arrows between concepts. She started researching grants, talking to social workers, calling people she never thought she'd have the courage to speak to. She visited centers in nearby towns and asked questions. She compiled notes in folders color-coded by topic. A fire had started somewhere inside her, and it refused to dim. One afternoon she gave a speech at a local women's center. Her palms sweat through the entire introduction. Her knees knocked slightly beneath the lectern, but when she started to speak, her voice leveled out. She told them not everything, never everything, but enough. Enough for them to understand what she had escaped and what she had become. Afterward, two women waited to speak with her. One had a black eye hidden under makeup. The other held a sleeping toddler. They didn't say much, but they hugged her, and she held on tightly. That night, back at the trailer, she found Martin fixing a dented toaster with his pocket knife. She told him about the speech, about the women. "They didn't say a word," she said, "but I could feel it. I made them feel seen." Martin nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's more than words." Bandit, now almost entirely gray around the muzzle, rested his head on her foot. There were hard days still. There were moments when the memory of the wedding came back like a shard of glass, a laugh echoing in the wrong key, the image of Randall's sneer, the sharp burn of humiliation. She'd wake some mornings with her jaw clenched and her hands curled into fists, but those days were fewer now, and when they came, she didn't run. She moved through them, knowing they didn't define her. In late spring, she received a letter from the local college. She opened it with trembling hands in the cafe bathroom, fingers smudged with flour and ink. The letter offered her a full scholarship. Social work. 4 years. Books included. She stood in front of the mirror and stared at her reflection. It wasn't disbelief that filled her, but awe. Not at the paper, but at the girl holding it. That night, she baked a pie in the cafe kitchen after hours, the way Molly had once shown her. She delivered it to Martin's trailer just past midnight. They ate it with spoons straight from the dish, Bandit licking crumbs from the floor. "You're leaving soon," Martin said between bites. "Not leaving," she corrected. "Just moving forward." He nodded. "You always were headed somewhere." She looked down at Bandit, who had fallen asleep on her foot again. "You too, you know. You saved me." Martin didn't reply, but his eyes softened and he patted Bandit's back gently. On the first anniversary of the wedding, she didn't cry. Instead, she organized a meal for the women at the shelter. She cooked herself, pasta and garlic bread, a salad with too many olives. Martin came late, carrying a folding table and 2 jugs of sweet tea. Molly and Jerry arrived with pies. The room buzzed with laughter, the clink of plastic forks, the scrape of chairs. No one mentioned the date, but as the evening wore on, a few women approached Naya quietly with soft thank yous and quick hugs. When it was over, Naya stood at the door, watching the last of the lights flicker out, her arms folded gently across her chest. She didn't think about the altar, or the dress, or the laughter. She thought about her own voice standing behind that podium, about the hands she had held, the woman she had become. Later that night, Martin handed her a small box. Inside was a hand-carved figure, an RV, its windows small but bright, its wheels crooked, and a tiny dog curled beneath it. On the bottom, burned into the wood, were 4 words: "The home we found." She didn't cry, not then. But when she returned to her room, placed it on the windowsill next to the photograph, and sat down at her desk, she opened her notebook and wrote again. This time it wasn't just a sentence, it was the beginning of something bigger. Rain tapped gently on the windows of the diner, not the kind of storm that drowned roads or knocked down trees, but the soft kind, like a memory returning uninvited. The sky was low and gray, and the air held that strange hush that always comes before something important, even if no one quite knows what. Inside, the diner was transformed. Balloons and shades of soft blue and silver floated above booths, ribbons curled around condiment containers, and a small banner, hand-painted and slightly crooked, hung over the counter. "Congratulations, Naya." The usual clink of plates and idle conversation had been replaced by laughter, applause, and the low hum of old jazz playing through the speakers. Gracie stood behind the counter with a hand on her hip, her eyes bright and proud. Jody had tears in her eyes as she brought out a tray of cupcakes, and even the cook, who never said much to anyone, had tied on a clean apron for the occasion. The diner, once just a place where Naya scrubbed dishes in silence, now felt like a cathedral built from coffee cups and second chances. She stood near the center of the room, wrapped in a crisp blue dress that clung to her figure just enough to remind her she had earned the right to stand tall. Her hair had been braided into a crown around her head, neat and elegant, and her shoes, new simple flats, made almost no sound as she shifted her weight nervously. In one hand, she held a small leather portfolio containing her diploma. The other was clenched tightly at her side. Through the window, the gravel lot shimmered with puddles. A familiar figure appeared just past the edge of the glass, and her breath caught. Martin. He was dressed in his usual work shirt, clean but well-worn, sleeves rolled to the elbow. His hair, once grizzled, had gone nearly white in the past few months. Bandit trotted at his side, slower now, his steps careful but determined. The old dog's tail wagged once as he reached the door. When Martin stepped into the diner, the room quieted just a beat, like the collective breath of every person paused to shift toward the moment. Then Naya was moving, crossing the floor without hesitation and throwing her arms around him before he could speak. "Jackrabbit," he muttered, startled but grinning. "You trying to knock the wind out of me?" "You made it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You thought I'd miss this?" he said. "I just watched you climb a mountain barefoot. I wasn't going to stay at the bottom." She stepped back, wiping at the corners of her eyes, her smile breaking wide and free. Around them, the room burst into applause again, but Naya hardly noticed. Martin's presence was enough. His silence, his unwavering eyes, the quiet pride he didn't know how to name but wore like a second skin. They sat together near the back, a table reserved just for them, a place of honor not for titles or wealth, but for truth and loyalty. Someone brought them plates stacked high with pancakes, eggs, sausage, fruit, more food than they could eat, but that wasn't the point. The point was the fullness, the plenty. Naya rested the diploma on the table between them. "I did it," she said simply. Martin's eyes were glassy, though he'd never admit it. He nodded, clearing his throat. "You sure did, kid." They ate slowly. Bandit lay beneath their feet, his breathing shallow but peaceful. He no longer chased squirrels or barked at passing cars, but he still watched her every move. After the meal, Gracie tapped her glass with a spoon. The sound drew everyone's attention. She cleared her throat and gestured to Naya. "We've all watched this girl walk through fire," she said. "Some of us knew her before she ever spoke a word. Some of us saw her clean plates when most people didn't even see her at all. And now, look at her." There were a few claps, soft murmurs of agreement. Today, she's graduating, not just with a degree, but with something more important. She's taken everything the world threw at her and turned it into purpose. That's rare. That's strength. And we are damn lucky to know her. Naya stood slowly, heart thudding hard in her chest. She hadn't expected a speech. She hadn't prepared one. But the words found her anyway. "I used to think I disappeared," she began. "Not literally, but in the way that people stop seeing you, in the way that the world looks through you. That's how it felt for a long time." She paused. Everyone was quiet now. Even the cook had turned to listen. "I didn't come from much. I didn't belong to the kind of places that hold ceremonies or give scholarships, and I definitely wasn't supposed to end up here, in a room full of people who care." She glanced at Martin. "But life doesn't follow the rules it writes for you. Sometimes when the whole world is telling you you're broken, someone shows up who sees you differently. Not as a victim, not as a failure, just as a person. Someone worth saving." Martin blinked and Naya smiled gently at him. "I want to be that person for someone else. That's why I went back to school, why I'll keep going, because I know what it's like to be standing in the dark waiting for someone to turn on the light." There were no cheers, just soft, respectful silence, and that meant more than noise. Afterward, the celebration drifted into laughter and shared stories. Naya received hugs, cards, even a handmade scarf from Jody. Someone brought out a guitar, and for a few minutes, the diner sounded like a front porch on a southern summer night. When the crowd began to thin and the sky shifted from gray to gold with the setting sun, Martin pulled Naya aside. "I got something for you," he said. From his jacket, he produced a small wrinkled envelope. Her name was scrawled on the front in crooked letters. She opened it carefully. Inside was a note, folded 3 times, and a key. The note was short. "You've always had the drive, now you've got the wheels." She looked up, confused. Martin jerked his head toward the back lot. She followed him outside where, tucked behind the building, stood a newly painted camper van. It wasn't fancy. The edges were worn, the tires not new, but it was clean, functional. On the side, someone had painted a single phrase in bright blue letters, "The Light Project." Naya covered her mouth. "Martin," he rubbed the back of his neck, "she's yours. Figured you'd need something to get around when the work starts. I got some help fixing her up. Jerry did the wiring. Molly sewed the curtains. Gracie gave us the paint." She stepped forward and touched the handle. It was real. Tangible, the beginning of something. Inside, the space was small but organized. A work desk, shelves with supplies, a little kitchenette. A bulletin board already pinned with a calendar and a few quotes. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll keep going," Martin said. "Say you won't stop now." She nodded, tears brimming. "I won't." That night, as the diner closed and the town settled into sleep, Naya stood beneath the street lamp, the key in her hand, the van at her back. Martin sat on the steps, Bandit resting beside him. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think home was a place, a house, 4 walls. And now?" She turned toward him, her silhouette framed in the golden glow. "Now I know it's people. It's safety. It's being seen." Martin smiled. "You built that, Naya. All of it." She walked toward him, leaned down, and kissed his forehead. "Thank you for being the first person who ever did." The rain had stopped. The night was cool, and as she climbed into the van and pulled away for the first time, the road ahead wasn't unknown anymore. It was waiting. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from something. She was heading toward it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more powerful stories on the channel and share this video with someone who needs to see it.